Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 4 of Stump the DPE. I'm here, as usual, with my co-host, Carl Hancock from Fly with the Guys. Hi, Carl. Glad to have you with us. If you have not yet, check him out, YouTube and other social media. Fly with the Guys is all you need to look for. Was there something you wanted to say there, Carl?
No, I'm good.
All right. Very good. Well, I appreciate you helping us out. So Carl is going to be watching the chat message. If you're new to Zoom, down somewhere on your control bar, you should see a chat option. Go ahead and type in your questions and we'll get to as many of them as we can. We're actually going to do something a little different this week, and I'm going to start by presenting my own question, or at least the answer. And to do that, I'm going to share my screen. Get to the right control here. All right. So this started, well, one of my favorite things about being a flight instructor is identifying things that are commonly confusing or misunderstood and coming up with an easy way to help people to understand it. So this morning on Greg Brown's Student Pilot Pep Talk group, this is a private Facebook group, I noticed this post from Kel Johnson sharing his study notes, what he calls IFR Stage 1. So we're going to start off talking about something for instrument pilots, whether you're working on your instrument rating or already an instrument pilot, this can help you out. For those of you that are not working on your instrument or not instrument pilots, you're welcome to tune out for a few minutes, but I encourage you to make a note and come back and watch the recording of this when you do start studying for your instrument written, something that'll help you out. So this is I think a 30-some page document. I did glance through it. Great job, Kel. You probably want a copy of this. If you're in Greg Brown's group, you can go download it there. It's just a Word document. I will say that most of the value of this for Kel was him putting it together. Most of this is screenshots and copying and paste from other documents. What I want to focus on right now is page 3, where he's got it's a little bit blurry, but it's a screenshot of something called primary and supporting instruments. I remember way back, 1993, when I was working on my instrument rating, and this whole concept of primary and supporting instruments, I thought I understood it. I would watch the videos, I would read the FAA books, I would then go do the practice test thinking that I understood it, and I would get questions wrong. Sometimes I'd get them right, thinking I knew what was going on, and then I would get other questions wrong. I'm like, what is going on with this? After I became a flight instructor and noticed that my own instrument applicants were having trouble with this concept, I came up with what I think is a unique way to look at this. And I want to thank Kel for prompting me on this, because after many years of teaching this morning is the first time that I've ever actually written it down. Usually I'm doing this on a dry erase board and making my students write it down. So this was a fun exercise for me. So I'm going to go through this real quick. I'll try to keep this concise, and then if you guys have questions, we can talk about it. So on the left side is the document that Kel posted. On the right side is my own notes, and I encourage you to pause the video if you're watching the recording of this. Write this down yourself. Right from the top, keep in mind, control and performance is a technique for flying airplanes, and primary supporting is a philosophy. That's important because when you read the FAA, like the Instrument Flying Handbook, they really kind of confuse it. It's hard to understand. There's some other documents that try, and I think they fail. But control performance means put the airplane where you want it with the proper power setting. That's the control part. And then look at the performance and see if it's giving you the performance that you want. That's the way that we fly airplanes. Those of you in instrument training, hopefully that's the way that your instructor is teaching you. Primary and supporting, I call that a philosophy because it's really more of a concept. And as far as I know, there's still questions on the FAA written test about this whole primary supporting thing. So it's something you need to understand to get through the written test, is how I recommend you thinking of primary and supporting. Also remember, just because we call something a primary instrument, that does not mean that it's the instrument you should be looking at to make a change. Very important. A lot of people get messed up because they think, oh, the altimeter is the primary instrument in this scenario. That doesn't mean you should be looking at the altimeter when you're pitching the airplane, as one example. So just think of primary in quotes like it's just a title for something we're talking about here. For this to work, remember the rule with 2 exceptions. There's some debate about this, but it works perfectly with this whole concept. The rule is to pitch for altitude. That includes pitching for vertical speed or pitching for a glide path, and then using power to control airspeed. That's the rule. There are 2 exceptions. Exception number 1 is when power is fixed. That means maximum or minimum. So maximum power climb, obviously we have to find the magic pitch angle to hold a certain airspeed. That's exception 1. With minimum, that would be simulating an engine failure or a real engine failure. If we don't have any power, obviously we have to pitch for best glide. So those are both examples of exception 1. Exception 2 is when we're flying on the backside of the power curve. To really understand that, you got to get into some aerodynamics that I'm not going to cover right now, but hopefully when you were taught how to do slow flight, you learned that once you get in slow flight, everything's reversed with pitch and power, meaning primarily you're going to power for altitude and you're going to pitch for airspeed. It has to do with controlling the induced drag that really goes up when you're on the backside of the power curve. So those are the 2 exceptions. Otherwise, we pitch for altitude, power for airspeed. All right, so the technique for primary and supporting. Let me go ahead and explain this document on the left that Cale found. He put it in page 3 of his document. So control, there's 3 columns here. The first column is control, and that basically is referring to the control performance concept of how to fly. Primary is what we're calling, or the FAA calls a primary instrument, and then there's a supporting instrument for each of the 3 categories of pitch, bank, and power. I do wish that they included a control instrument more for power. I don't know why they left that blank. I consider the RPM or the manifold power or manifold pressure to be the control, meaning if we Cessna 172, downwind to beam the numbers, I'm going to pull the power to 1500 RPM. Actually look at the RPM and move the throttle to put the RPM right at 1500. That's a control input. And so it should say RPM for something like that. For some reason they left that blank, which is fine. Then we have the primary instrument for each of those pitch, bank, and power, and then the supporting instrument. So that's how you read the table. Hopefully you don't try to just memorize this, because if you do that, it's really confusing and it's too much to memorize. So here's a better way. Step number 1, consider the goal. That's a question. What am I trying to hold? And that means for pitch, bank, and power. And I give examples of the different goals. For pitch, when we're talking about instrument flying, it's usually going to be either holding a constant altitude or a constant vertical speed. It could be a glide path like flying an ILS approach, but I'll just keep it simple. I like to teach when you're flying like a 3-degree glide slope to pitch to find a certain vertical speed based on your ground speed, and then to watch the glide slope. Bank goals would be either constant heading or a standard rate turn. Years ago, we used to do steep turns as part of the instrument training, but we don't do that anymore. So it's pretty much just going to be a constant heading or a standard rate turn. And then power goals, usually that's for constant speed, constant airspeed. Let me change that actually, constant airspeed. Okay, so step number 2, that was step 1 of the technique, is consider the goal. What am I trying to do for pitch, bank, and power? And then here's the magic, okay? Step number 2, the question is ask this question for pitch, bank, and power. So you're gonna ask it 3 times. The question is, which instrument tells me if I need to make a change? That is the key. Once you understand the rule with 2 exceptions, and you understand that we've got pitch, bank, and power, simply ask which instrument tells me if I need to make a change. Not the instrument to look at to make the change, but if I need to make a change. The answer to that question is the primary instrument. And then the supporting instruments are simply all of the other instruments that would change if you make that change. Let's go through a few examples here with the diagram. Starting easy, straight and level. What is the goal for pitch? The goal is to hold constant altitude. What is the goal the goal for bank. The goal is to hold a constant heading because we're doing straight and level. And then power, we'll just assume we're trying to hold a certain airspeed, call it 100 knots. So heading 360, 5,000 feet, 100 knots. Those are the goals. Now that we've done step one, we consider the goals, ask the question, which instrument tells me if I need to make a change? So which instrument tells me if I need to push the yoke forward or pull back? The only instrument with that information is the altimeter. That's why it's the primary instrument. And which instrument tells me if I need to move the ailerons left or right? The only instrument is the heading indicator, because the goal is to hold a constant heading. Which instrument tells me if I need to move the power in or out? The goal was to hold 100 knots, so the primary instrument has to be the airspeed indicator. Hopefully a light bulb just went off for a lot of you. That is the most simple way I found to teach this. Again, the supporting instruments are simply what else would change if I were to pitch, bank, or power, make adjustments. Let's just do one or two more, a little more complicated. So showing the exception to the rule. Let's see, they've got minimum controllable airspeed right here. Minimum controllable airspeed means slow flight. Well, we said that when we're in slow flight, we're primarily going to, put my cursor in the right place here, right here, pitch for airspeed. That is why the primary pitch instrument becomes the airspeed indicator. It's reversed because we're on the backside of the power curve. So this table does take that into account. And that gives me confirmation that my rule with two exceptions is a good way to be teaching. What's another one? Oh, it also gets confusing when they talk about, where is it? The entry, like a climb entry, they have the primary pitch instrument is the attitude indicator. That is assuming that you have figured out what the proper pitch angle is for your airplane. So not only is the attitude indicator in that moment your control instrument to control the airplane, but you're actually going to a certain pitch attitude as your primary instrument for the entry. Once you're in the entry, then you would go to, well, what is the goal? Is the goal constant airspeed or constant rate? So if the goal is a constant airspeed climb, obviously the airspeed is the only instrument that tells you if you need to make a change. If the goal is a constant rate climb, then the only instrument that tells you if you need to make a change is the vertical speed. So hopefully you can see that the answer of what the primary instrument is changes with the goal. And when you're going through the FAA written test questions and doing practice tests, and they have questions like this, that's what you need to focus on, is what is the goal? And then then ask the question, which one tells you if you need to make a change? So hopefully that helps. Again, if you're watching the recording of this, you can pause the video and write this down. There's not a lot to it. And there you go. If you have any questions, you're watching this on the recording, go ahead and post it down below in the comments, and we'll have a fun discussion about it. What do you think of that, Carl?
Well, you know, you taught me that, so.
Did we get to that yet? You're still working on, you're officially starting your instrument training, so.
Oh, no, you taught me a lot of that stuff.
All right, very good. I do apply a lot of it to VFR as well. So I would like to unmute Greg and get your feedback on that, Greg. Oh, I'm not the host anymore. There you go, Greg. You can unmute yourself. So curious what you think of that, Greg. Have you seen anyone else teach it quite that way?
No, I have not. And it's a great idea because everyone's always confused by it.
So I might actually cut that part out and make a standalone video. And I just realized I forgot something else that's important. So mute yourself again, Greg. And I'm going to have some editing to do. You like that? We're making videos live on Stump the DPE. All right, quiet. So another part that's really important with the control performance is to understand what that expected pitch and power setting is for your particular airplane. What I recommend is making what I call a pitch power performance table. Here's an example for a 182 RG that a couple of my clients fly. It's actually a father and son that are working on their instrument, and they just had a new glass panel put in. So we've kind of started from scratch with what are the exact pitch angles that work with their new Dynon system. So it's been kind of fun. It's not complete yet, but this gives you an idea of the pitch, power, and configuration settings. And then the resulting airspeed and vertical speed would be the performance side of it. And especially for instrument training, this is important to be able to set something and have an expectation, a good expectation of the performance you're going to get from it. All right. I don't know if that's going to work to edit all that together, but we'll give it a try. So with that, Carl, you got some questions coming?
No,
I wasn't sharing my screen when I did that just now, did I? Doggone it. That's okay. I'm not going to mess with that anymore. Maybe when we're all done, I'll pull that up and do that part again.
It's called a transition.
There you go. There you go. All right. So with that, what questions are coming in?
We didn't really get any questions on that.
Okay, that's
Dan was mentioning how they teach some of this stuff at AeroGuard. So I'm not sure if he wants to try to explain that live to us.
Go ahead and unmute yourself there, Dan. Hey, Joe. Joe got his camera. Welcome.
Hey, can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah, you're on my headset. I'm getting ready for a meeting. So, yeah. So actually, Kyle Rusick is a PPL student of mine. He's in the chat right now. Because Jim, I told him they might get you. So, tune in and kind of hear some of the stuff straight from you.
Nice.
Because it's all the same stuff I tell them. So I actually we teach that, and I was slow to adopt because growing up, in the Part 6 world, relative to aviation in the Part 61 world a couple of years ago, I always heard pitch for airspeed, power for altitude. And that's how I learned. So then I come to AeroGuard, and we're learning about the new aircraft, we're learning about the new systems and policies, and then Gene Zandy comes in and says, oh, hey, by the way, we do it this way. And like immediate silence falls over the room because we're all thinking, well, you can't do that. That's not how it works.
So backwards.
So, yeah. So then all through stands, I'm teaching it this way, I'm saying the words, but I'm still in my mind thinking the other way. So then when I got my students, I really had to kind of commit to we pitch for airspeed, power for altitude. And so Kyle can attest that, typically when it applies to landings, this is where it really becomes relevant, where I say pitch for the aiming point, that's your altitude, and power for that airspeed. So when we started doing that, and it clicked, then it's all of a sudden like, oh, this actually makes a whole lot of sense, especially as it applies to flying jets, which is what we're training them for. So on the checklist that I made during stands, I actually copied and pasted a pitch power table from our AOM and just stuck it right on there for quick reference. So that's something that all my students have. So if I ever say something like, hey, what's our straight and level pitch power setting? They have the table right to flip to. So I think that makes a whole lot of sense. The way you explained it is basically exactly how we're teaching it, or how we should be teaching it over at AeroGuard. So I'm really glad to hear that's part of this presentation, because even the PPL guys are getting that too.
Thank you. And thank you for introducing that to them early in training, especially in a professional training environment like you guys are doing, where it's just a matter of weeks before they're going to be instrument students. So
exactly.
Get that in there early. So let's talk more about this. I'm going to let you go ahead and mute yourself again there, Dan, and thank you for bringing that in. So I mentioned this briefly on the other part that I may or may not turn into a standalone video. So when we understand the aerodynamics of power versus drag, we'll even just start with the fundamentals. You guys have all seen, turn that light back down, the diagram that shows what do we call it? Equilibrium of flight, where thrust equals drag. And in that scenario, or that situation where we're in steady state flight, this diagram can be used to either represent the thrust or represent the drag. So ignore the title at the top. You saw me go and do a quick Google search. This is from Bold Method, I believe. They do nice drawing. So don't worry about the title. This could be a drag curve as easy as it could be a thrust curve. And what it represents is the fact that the faster we go, you got airspeed down here at the bottom. Actually, they do have drag over here on the other side. So the faster we go, the less induced drag we have, because the other variables that go into creating lift are greater. We're holding, say, 5,000 feet. The faster we go, the lower the angle of attack required, and therefore less induced drag. The slower we go, the more we have to increase angle of attack to maintain altitude. And so there's more induced drag. Parasite drag is the other one. That's just things, you stick your hand out the window, the wing strut, the wheel, all that stuff hanging out there is parasite drag, including skin friction. The faster we go, the more parasite drag there is. Well, you remember 8th grade graphing. If you add those two lines together, you get the blue line, kind of looks like a smiley face. That represents total drag, or again, total thrust required to maintain equilibrium. All right, so here in the middle, that's the area where we have, or the point where we have the least drag. And we represent it here as an airspeed. It's better to think of it as an angle of attack. Because most of us are not flying with angle of attack indicators, we'll just use airspeed. It's the best thing we've got. So at that particular airspeed, it's what we call L over D max, which is your lift over drag ratio to the max, or the maximum, or the least drag. All right. Being on the front side of the power curve means that we're on the right side of that low point. Being on the back side means we're on the left side of the low point. Well, as you can see, when we go into slow flight, the slower we get over here, induced drag really goes up. Therefore, total drag really goes up. And when you're in slow flight, use my little airplane here, and you're at a high angle of attack, a small change in pitch causes a very large change in induced drag, which we see as a change in airspeed. I keep hitting my metal water bottle with my metal airplane. Sorry about that. And so that's why we primarily teach to pitch for airspeed control. And then the only way to power, and if we're a little bit low in slow flight and we need to climb back up, the only way to do that is by adding thrust. We've got to overcome all that drag with thrust. So we primarily will power for altitude in slow flight. So once someone understands those aerodynamics, then we can go back to the rule with two exceptions. And let me just give you some sympathy or empathy, Dan. It's normal for people to disagree on this subject. If you were to go back ever since aviation magazines have been written and look for it, you can find articles, people arguing that you should pitch for altitude and other people saying you should power for altitude. The reason there's a lot of confusion on this is because both of them work. The reality is we use, in most training airplanes, we use pitch and power together. Where this really comes up is talking about landing and what is the proper technique for landing. You were talking about that a little bit a few minutes ago. So a flight instructor goes out and gains thousands and thousands of hours in a Cessna or a Piper, showing that very nicely when you're on final, power changes work great for getting you in the right position to land. And so they teach power for going up and down, and changing the pitch works really well for changing the airspeed. So that's what the instructors teach. It doesn't make it right or wrong. I like to think of these kinds of things as good, better, and best, meaning teaching it that way is good. I suggest that there's a better way. The better way is the rule with two exceptions. Here's why I think this is better. First of all, it's still true. It doesn't make anyone else right or wrong, but it gets us to focus on the right things at the right time, especially like you were talking about at your flight school, when you're talking about someone that's getting ready to go fly a jet. Because when you get into swept wing airplanes, things change quite a bit. And not just the swept wing, but also the fact that a turbine engine takes several seconds to spool up and spool down. And if you're trying to power for airspeed, and you're not staying ahead of it, you're gonna be in trouble. So every airplane you fly will have different techniques. That being said, the rule fits for all airplanes, and I've flown everything from a 150 through the CRJ 900. That's the biggest one I've flown, and this works. Just understand that when you are in a typical training airplane on short final, you're probably on the back side of the power required curve. So it does make sense to pitch for airspeed and power for glide path. You're following the exception when you're doing that. You're not throwing the rule out the window. You just understand it's a rule with two exceptions. I have posted this places. I had one gentleman, I believe he's a flight instructor, kind of try to argue that if what I had to say here was true, there wouldn't be any exceptions. Like he thinks that there should be an answer that is the answer all the time. I don't think you can make it that simple. There's too many variables, and this whole thing of being on the front or the back of the power curve really changes the equation. So the best I've come up with is a rule with 2 exceptions. I'm very confident that I've got something here that is worth sharing and teaching. If someone out there has a idea, a new thought, or a way to make it better, I'm always open to that. So that is what I recommend. And I'm glad to hear that your flight school is basically teaching the same things. They're at least teaching the rule. I think it's important to teach the 2 exceptions as well. Exception 1, talk about that a little more, is you gotta point that out to the new students. Otherwise, if you just teach them to pitch for altitude and power for airspeed, now as soon as you teach them to climb out to the practice area, you're telling them to hold a certain pitch for VY. That seems wrong if you don't explain that that's an exception. Because we have full power, we can't just power for airspeed. We're going to pitch for airspeed now, as exception 1 states. So, all right.
Talk about that. And actually, Kyle just had his first.
Any other comments, questions? What do we got?
We don't have any. Well, Greg made a comment. Maybe he can explain that a little bit better. If you'd like to unmute yourself, Greg.
Come on back, Greg. Are you there? His picture went away. There he is.
Well, which comment do you have in mind? And then I'll see if I
He's probably been saying all kinds of things about me over there in the chat room that I'm not looking at.
Said something about your hair, but it's fine.
Yeah. Love it.
I'm just teasing. No, he was talking about the pitching and power table.
Okay. Comments on that, Greg?
on that, or are you thinking of someone else there?
Oh, George.
George, Greg, you saw a G.
There's only a few 4-letter words I'd rather not be called. George has got more letters too, so it's okay.
Oh my goodness. George, are you somewhere you can unmute and talk to us? There should be, down on your controls, there should be participants. There you go.
He says, hold on.
Okay. That's fine. Any other questions while we're waiting for George?
Not so far. And I mess up names and things, guys, because I was not taught phonics. I was taught word memorization. So when my brain sees the right number of letters, that's just how it comes out.
How you doing, guys?
Hey, we're doing great. George, glad you could make it.
How you doing? Okay, so I feel like everything you're saying is absolutely correct, but I feel like the pitch power table, the chart is good to reference, to get an idea of to get to where we want to be at. But I feel like when we're flying, it's always different, especially with the RPM settings. Example, from the initial approach fix to the final approach fix, they want us to, for non-precision approaches, they want us to be at 1500 RPMs to descend down to the altitude at the final approach fix. But I feel like it's always different.
Yeah.
So I just think it's
so
that charge just for reference. That's it.
Yes, exactly. Thank you for bringing that up. There's a really good point that goes along with that, and that is the bigger. Well, first, a cliche. You probably heard this: the bigger the airplane, the easier it is to fly. That's true, and let me tell you what that saying is referring to. And to understand it, you got to think of a simple comparison to boats in the ocean. Okay. And, this is a good comparison when you're talking about things like load factor or minimum or max maneuvering speed, those kinds of things. Imagine you're in the ocean on a stormy day and the waves are moving around. One boat is a little 8-foot fishing boat and the other one is an aircraft carrier. Which one is going to be more affected by the waves is one of the questions. Obviously, the little boat's going to be getting tossed all over the place. And the aircraft carrier is probably not even going to notice that there's any waves or wind or anything out there because it's so big and so heavy. The same thing happens with airplanes in the atmosphere. A small training airplane like you've been flying, the Piper Archer, is going to have a lot more, it's going to be influenced by something as simple as the temperature changing a few degrees or a little bit of updraft or downdraft. Whereas when I'm flying even the CRJ, which is a pretty small jet, because we're heavier, we're coming in somewhere between 55 and 65,000 pounds usually coming into land. And we're just going to plow right through those up and down drafts and the bumps that you're feeling in the Archer. So I know that's all pretty simplistic, but that's important to envision it that way and understand what's going on. So there's a bit of a challenge from the flight instructor's point of view, or the flight school. In your case, you're at a professional school where they want you to learn these concepts from day one. And then they put you in a little 4-seat airplane that's less than 3,000 pounds. And you are absolutely correct. It is different on every day. But don't let that discourage you. Just know that you're learning good concepts, and it at least gives you a starting point. And just know that, well, this is one of those days that density altitude's different, so I'm going to need a little more power or a little less power. Pitch is another tough one. If you're using round gauge instruments, the standard attitude indicator, I mean, can you really tell the difference between 5 degrees or 7 degrees on one of those? I mean, that's what we had in this this 182. I'm going to share that back. That before they got their new Dynon panel, they had a standard 6-pack, and we had completely different numbers here. We actually used bar widths. That's what I recommend. Is it's usually the bar on the horizon, or it's 1 bar up, 1 bar down, half a bar up, half a bar down, because that's about as precise as you can be with those old attitude indicators, which is what you're used to so far, George. I'm sorry, you're on the G1000 now. So on the G1000 or the Dynon system like this customer got, you can actually be very precise with the pitch angles, but because you're in a light airplane, you're going to notice that it will be different on different days. So thank you for bringing that up. Good point. All right.
Sounds
Not a lot
like
of questions today, huh, guys?
no, it's pretty quiet over
Yeah,
here.
well, I'm glad I had stuff to talk about. This is good.
Um,
We're socializing. That's the main point here, right? Having fun.
Absolutely. Yeah. So no real questions here. It's a little bit of chat between some people in the chat.
Any good topics? Let's see. Oh, Greg, he's leaning forward. He's got something to say. We can't hear you, but you're welcome to unmute if you got any other topics to talk about. Since I mentioned Greg's Facebook group, this is a private group, and anyone who's a student or instructor involved with flight training is welcome to apply. I will not only put in a plug for it, but I'll let you know this is one of the most unique groups on Facebook. Facebook has come to be known for, like most social media, a place for people to be nasty to each other. And hats off to Greg. Not only is he a great gatekeeper, preventing the spammers and the riffraff from coming into the group, but he is also very good at managing the group, moderating, that's the word. He's a great moderator, and he does it mostly himself. So thank you for all your hard work on that, Greg. So I will tell you, if you guys are looking to share politics or argue with someone or demean someone in any way, even if you think you're joking, this is not the group for you. Greg will kick you out without even giving you a second chance. And that might sound harsh, but that's what we need. That's the kind of moderating that it takes when you've got 2,500 members in a private group. So that being said, because of Greg doing all that hard work, this is, in my opinion, the best place for online support for anyone in flight training, both the students and the instructors. It's a safe place to ask questions. In fact, you know what, Greg, I think everyone should hear how this started years and years ago. We got some time. Go ahead and tell us what we had before Facebook, what you tried to do, and how this even came about.
Well, what happened first, before I forget, you can search in Facebook, Student Pilot Pep Talk Group is the name that will get you there. If you don't answer the questions, I won't let you in. So please answer the questions and for consideration. But yeah, what happened was I learned a long time ago that every one of us as pilots has run into this, right? Student pilots, whatever, you're at the airport and someone comes back from a tough lesson, they had a terrible landing, or they went into a spin by accident and were frightened or whatever, and they're pretty upset about it. And so I'll bet every one of us who's here today in this gathering has run into someone like that. And we gave him a little pep talk and said, well, you know, I had that happen to me one time, and, you know, you'll get past it. You'll be okay. We provided some encouragement, and we kept somebody flying. I would almost bet money every single person in here has done this numerous times. Even if you're a relatively new student pilot, you've helped someone over that rough spot. So this is a particularly big problem for people for students who are in places where there's no support. Like, you're studying with one flight instructor and you don't, an independent, and you're not meeting other students, or you're at a busy city operation where nobody has time to talk. There is nobody there maybe to say, I had a bad lesson today, give me a pep talk. So you quit. So I actually approached the Kings and Rod Machado and some other people and said, you should do some videos that are pep talks for people who are discouraged. I talked to AOPA that they should promote it with their 800, free pilot support line. And then I thought, what the heck, I'll start a Facebook group. And it really has been a wonderful experience, because we've got folks from Keith Lamb, who is a Dreamliner captain and owns a 182 and until recently a 152, Jim Pittman, Joe Stanley here today, who are, seasoned instructors. And then we've got all kinds of sharp students, and private pilots are welcome also, by the way. There's no bar here in terms of who can get in, as long as you're civil and I know who you are. But, sometimes the best person you could get a pep talk from is the person 2 lessons ahead of you who just went through this and got over it. So that's the whole concept for the group. And so we just try and keep everyone supportive and civil, and keep the people out who are dissing others or making fun of them for dumb questions, because we're in a business where there's definitely no dumb questions. So anybody who's listening would like to apply to join, do answer the questions, please. If you have a lot of political stuff on your page, or, that sort of thing makes me a little uncomfortable, and, it doesn't usually end up well if that enters the group. So as Jim pointed out, any kind of political discussion, those people are immediately removed, because our group is all about what we have in common, which is our passion for flying. It has nothing to do with all those other things we could argue about. Anyway, that's the story.
Thank you for sharing the backstory there. So the questions that Greg's referring to, as soon as you find the group on Facebook and you click the button, I think it says ask to join, something like that. I believe that people immediately get 3 questions. Is that right, Greg?
That's right. And they're basic questions like, what's your interest in flying, and where do you fly out of, and what flight school, what kind of aircraft, because obviously that provides a good filter for me. If someone has no connection to flying and no apparent connection to flying, then, they are not likely to be contributors to the group. So they're very, these are not test questions. These are questions about who you are, so we can determine if it's something you will benefit by and we will benefit by.
And you do like to see people using their real name on Facebook, correct?
It's very important to me, but I'll tell you one thing I have done. There are people who, for various reasons, don't want to share their full name for good reasons. And then there are a lot of them with nefarious reasons. But so one of the questions is this your full name? Is this your real name? Mm-hmm. And if it's not, why not? And what is your real name? And, I don't need to share that, but I want to know that the folks are real.
Very good.
So it's straightforward. There's nothing special there, but just know that if you don't answer the questions, that saves me a lot of trouble rejecting you.
Right.
Well, I was going to add to it too, is Greg Brown's group is nice. And this is something that I do with my YouTube channel as well, is that there's no dumb question, even if it's been asked 100 times, because each person who's asking these questions feel that they're in a unique position and we need to answer them in a unique way. And that's something that Greg Brown's group is very, very good at. And like he was saying, it's like we're there to pick people up, bring them into aviation, and acting in that way, making every situation unique, is definitely more powerful.
Very good. The only other thing I'd like to throw in on that is because this recording is going to be posted on YouTube, and I know that there's a certain percentage of our population that is anti-Facebook, which is understandable. Trust me, there's certain days that I'm wondering if I want to be on Facebook. That being said, just know that if the reason you don't want to be on Facebook has to do with, an ex finding you, or not wanting to connect with certain people that are on Facebook, that's fine. Just know that there's settings that you can go into. You got to dig a little bit. Go to YouTube, search for some how-to videos for Facebook settings, but you do have the option to turn off all the default stuff, because of course Facebook wants you to be open to the whole world. Go into your settings. You can lock down your account to essentially make it invisible. And the only thing you use Facebook for is getting into Greg Brown's Student Pilot Pep Talk group. That, in my opinion, just for flight training would be a good enough reason to have a Facebook login. So,
May I add to that?
please.
So, I mean, that's actually a really good point. It was an open group at the beginning, and several people asked me to change it. One of the benefits is a lot of people who are in flight training don't want, they either have family members or friends they don't want to know, or more commonly, they don't want to reveal their insecurities or their concerns to their family, the people who are going to ride with them, which is totally understandable. So making the group private really helped in that regard, because you can reveal your thoughts, your concerns, your questions, and unlike other, public groups where it shows up on your own page in many cases, other folks can't see it. So there's a degree of privacy there in revealing concerns that you otherwise maybe want to keep from your loved ones.
Good point. All right, awesome. Any specific questions come in the chat, Carl?
Just one about timed approaches.
Okay, we covered that one before. What's the question today?
It comes from George, so if he wants to unmute and
Hi, George.
give his 2 cents.
And it's okay that we covered it before. This is a different day, different audience. So,
Hi guys.
hey, yeah, go for it.
Okay, I have a question about the time approaches. I've noticed that like when you start the time from your final approach fix to the missed approach point, it's not always the same number as it says on the chart. Like I think I forgot what airport I was at. I think I was in Chandler, but I reached my missed approach point in about 3 minutes, and the chart said I was gonna be there supposedly about 5 minutes and 30 seconds or something like that. So I wanted to ask like how do people use it? Like it doesn't make sense to me how they got this time.
So, for everyone else's benefit, what George is asking about is a specific procedure for instrument approaches in a scenario where, for some reason, we don't have GPS, we don't have DME, distance measuring equipment information, and we're using a stopwatch to figure out the time from the final approach fix to the missed approach point. And for certain approaches, it's published right on the chart in a table that depends on your ground speed. So the first thing you want to do, George, is watch your ground speed. That's difficult because if whoever you're doing this approach with is being accurate in the scenario, then we probably don't have GPS working. So in real life, you wouldn't have your ground speed to look at. But a lot of times when we're just simulating this stuff, you can actually still look somewhere on your panel and see your ground speed. And that should be the same as what's in the chart. So that time that you saw on the chart was associated with a certain ground speed, probably 90 knots. So if you got to the missed approach point early, it's probably because you had a tailwind coming in on the approach. Do you happen to remember for the particular time that you were using as an example, do you happen to remember noting your ground speed?
No, actually, I didn't note the ground speed. But
that would be the thing to watch for next time. Is it's not just, oh, I always use 90 knots because I'm flying indicated at 90 knots or about 90 knots, but it's really a ground speed. And there's times, especially if the scenario is that, we'll use your one at Chandler there. Maybe the scenario is that they're using runway 22. There's 22 left and right. And you're expecting to come in on the, what is it, the VOR, I think it's 4 right approach. And you're coming in with the intention to circle because the winds are favoring 2-2. As soon as you listen to the ATIS, that should be a hint that you're probably gonna have a tailwind on final, and you can actually look at your ground speed, assuming you have GPS that gives you ground speed, and see that, wow, even though I'm indicating 90 knots, I'm actually doing 100 or 110, and it might take a little bit of interpolation real quick to figure out what the time should be, but I think the table goes from 90 to 120 knots. You're probably going to be somewhere in the middle, and then adjust your time accordingly. In real life, the time, when you're doing a timed approach, it's probably a non-precision approach. Usually in real life, we're dealing with clouds that are either broken or overcast, and you're going to get down under the clouds before you get to the missed approach point, hopefully. If not, you're probably going to have to go missed anyway. And the FAA builds some wiggle room in there so that if you do have a headwind or a tailwind and time is the only way to identify the missed approach point, you're still in the clouds, you go missed. Maybe you're not exactly at the right place, but you're close enough. But definitely pay attention to the ground speed.
Can I add something to that, Jim?
Please.
So as someone who did a lot of those timed approaches when we used to have to do them all the time, one is today's pilots they're not always thinking about, what are the winds aloft today? But it's always good to have a mental picture as the winds are westerly at 20 knots or whatever, just roughly, so that you can at least know whether you got a headwind or a tailwind while you're shooting this approach, right? And the second thing to understand is if you got a tailwind and you have to descend, which normally you would, if you don't get down promptly, you may not get out of the clouds till you're past the airport. So again, knowing you have a tailwind means get the heck down there to the minimum descent altitude. And if you have a headwind, the airport may not show up when you expect, but you might not be there yet. So it's really important to at least have a grasp of, what is this airplane probably truing roughly over the ground, and what kind of winds do I have, head or tailwind, and will this be shorter or longer than I expect? And then always on those timed approaches, you want to get down promptly to the minimum descent altitude. Because the other factor you've got is some airplanes descending. If you're going down promptly, you're going to go faster than you normally, than you'd be cruising, even if you're trying to keep it slow.
Great point. And it's not just.
And can I add something to that? Well?
Yeah.
Sorry, this is Dan. So I private messaged George back in the chat about his 1500 RPM thing and how that doesn't always work. So George, just kind of because this is exactly where it's relevant, and Jim, I'm sure you can talk more about this, but 1500 RPM is the initial power setting for your descent, because on a non-precision approach, you'll notice that's 100 RPM lower than on a precision approach, because we're not trying to hold a glide path. We're trying to get down to that step down fix or that MDA as quick as we can to try to get out of the clouds. So that's what I wanted to add. Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's perfect. I was just going to add that it's not just for instrument pilots having that mental picture of the general winds, but even going out to the practice area to do VFR maneuvers, knowing here in Arizona, a lot of the time of year we've got a breeze out of the southwest, and understanding that may be a little bit different down close to the ground for ground reference maneuvers. It's good to at least have that mental model in mind of what are the prevailing winds today as you head out there. So a little bonus tip here. Let me share my screen. I just did a quick search for mental math. I typed in mental math descent rate, and then bold method, like I said earlier, they make pretty pictures. So I pulled this one up. This is actually an article you can go find. They talk about something called the 60-to-1 rule, but without reading through this, I'll just tell you a couple that we use all the time flying the jet. And this is something, it's called descent planning. There's an old saying that when you start flying jets, you can either go down or you can slow down, but you can't do both at the same time. And there's a lot of truth to that. And one of the things that new pilots, flight instructors usually, that are coming to the airlines, the regional airlines, first time flying the jet, one of the things that they typically struggle with is descent planning. Because in the little airplane world, we pretty much just look out the window, kind of like this picture that's up on the screen, and say, oh, okay, there's the airport, time to just point the nose at the airport or point the nose at the downwind entry. And usually we're doing cruise altitudes that it's really no big deal coming in visually, and it doesn't take a lot of forethought. When you're flying the jet and you're up at altitudes, 30, 35,000 feet typically, we go at my airline, we go up to flight level 370, and it takes some planning. So a couple rules of thumb that you can start using even in the little airplane world, and that is how many miles away do you need to start down? And I think this article, just glancing at it, is going to go through the details, but it's basically to figure out the number of thousands of feet that you need to descend and multiply it times 3. So if you are 10,000 feet above the airport, doing a nice high cross country, just to make the math easy, 30 miles away is when you should start down, okay? And if you're, like flying the jet, at 30,000 feet, that means you need to start 90 miles away. And that gives you roughly a 3-degree glide path all the way down, which in the jet is nice for being able to control the speed. Keep in mind, when we get to 10,000, we got to slow down, be below 250 or slower below 10,000. So the other rule of thumb is then, okay, now I know how far away I need to start down. How quickly do I need to go down? And this goes along with George's question related to ground speed, or at least it's related, and that is 5 times your ground speed. So if your ground speed is 100 knots, you should be descending at 500 feet per minute. And the math's easy on that one. If your ground speed's 90 knots, 9 times 5 is 45, add the 0 back, 450 feet per minute. Meaning if your ground speed's 90 knots and you're descending at 450 feet per minute, you are descending at a 3-degree glide path or glide slope, which is the technique that you should be using for flying an instrument approach like an ILS or an LPV. So a couple quick rules of thumb there that we use all the time in the real world that you can start using even in the VFR world. So. All right, guys. Well, we're getting close to an hour here. Any questions come in, Carl?
No, nothing more. I think that might just wrap this one up.
We'll go ahead and wrap it up. I actually do have another meeting here with my daughter's school at the top of the hour. So thank you, everyone, for coming on live. The primary goal here is to socialize and to keep our brains spinning on aviation topics. So thank you for participating live. For those of you watching the recording, we hope you can join us live next time. And thank you, Carl, for helping to host. And thank you, Greg, for joining in. And thank you again for everything you're doing on the private Facebook group. And we'll see you guys there. And I usually post the announcement there when we schedule these. I still don't have a regular day and time each week, just kind of taking it as it goes. But if you guys have requests for a different day or time of day, feel free to contact me through my website, FlywithJim.com. And with that, y'all have a great day. Talk to you next time.
Thank you, Jim.
Yep. Thank you.